So I am very pleased to welcome all of you to the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And one of the pleasures of my job as Chancellor is to be able to have a dialogue such as this, where the role of UMass Dartmouth as a catalyst for social and cultural and economic transformation is evident in a number of ways, such as in convenings like this. I know that the statistics are fluid on the issue of how many children have crossed the border, but they are as high as 68,000 this year, which some people say is double the number from last year, and as many as 40,000 have been successfully placed in families and foster homes. So according to Amnesty International, the number of children crossing the border continues to surge, and more children are expected to arrive in the next several months. So this is an issue that directly affects our local community. Unaccompanied minors have been arriving in New Bedford and elsewhere in Massachusetts for many years. So we're privileged to have our Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Lisa Maya Nauer, serving as a moderator to lead the discussion on this topic. Dr. Nauer has worked with and written about the Central American community in New Bedford since 2007, and she spent 2011 in Guatemala as a Fulbright scholar. And sí habla español muy bien, Professor Nauer. She traveled back to Guatemala this past summer. Professor Nauer has also worked very closely with the Centro Humanitarian de Trabajadores in New Bedford.
So I'm going to speak to you today as an anthropologist who, as Chancellor Grossman mentioned, does research in Central America and with the community here, but I also do work in communities in Guatemala that have been the source of migrants to the United States, where migration to the United States, either for a specified period of time or for more or less indefinitely, has become part of the fabric of everyday life. I was recently in the Cancobal Maya town of Santa Eulalia and Huehuetenango, where I came across a Hotel Atlanta. And so the names of businesses are often an index of how normalized migration to the United States. So there's now a Cancobal migration to Georgia, and I discovered this. I'm also the daughter and granddaughter of immigrants. And in addition, I serve as an expert witness in asylum and other immigration cases, in some cases using my scholarly expertise to testify on behalf of people who are seeking asylum or some other kind of relief. So this is also an example of ways that you can put your scholarly credentials to some use out in the world. I just want to make a couple of points to put this discussion in context. For a few weeks over the summer, the media were all full of stories about this unprecedented surge of unaccompanied Central American teenagers and children streaming across the border, flooding the already overtaxed immigration and border patrol system. And I don't want to diminish in any way the reality of the humanitarian crisis that ensued in the area around the border. Facilities filled way beyond capacity, children crowded into holding pens or sleeping on the floor because there were no beds for them. And although the news cameras have moved on to other issues, that humanitarian crisis is still there. I work with an attorney in Austin, Texas, who has been trying to represent and to find legal representation for migrants, including mothers and their children who are locked up at the Karnes County Detention Center, where many of the detainees are indigenous Guatemalans who don't speak enough Spanish to meaningfully communicate with attorneys, and therefore, in the absence of translators, are not, in this attorney's view, able to obtain adequate legal representation. And I know Irina's going to talk more about some of the challenges of working with this community. So there were this kind of hysterical reaction about the flood of brown-skinned people from poor countries in our hemisphere and calls to tighten the border. This during a presidency that has broken all previous records for the detention and deportation of immigrants, principally to Central America and to Mexico. And while it's true that more children were apprehended at the border and that the situation in these detention facilities was dire, with many migrants being held for as long as 10 or 11 months, either because they had no U.S. resident relatives to vouch for them, that is, no relatives with legal status, or because their relatives couldn't put up the bond. In fact, there has been a drop in undocumented migration to the United States in the last decade. The arrivals in 2013, which is the last complete year for which we have figures, were over 60% lower than those in 2004. That's according to a study from Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. And the authors argue, and I've seen several other scholarly articles that make a similar argument, that what has increased is the Border Patrol's ability to apprehend migrants. And that's not surprising given the increase in their budget and the increase in the number of Border Control agents. So it's not that more people are coming across, but that a higher proportion of those who make the attempt are caught and wind up in the immigrant detention system. The second point that I want to make is about whether child migration or unaccompanied child migration is really that unprecedented. During the 19th century, the large influx of Irish and other European immigrants to the United States, I'm talking about the middle part of the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution, it included many teenagers traveling alone who came as indentured servants, who came fleeing political unrest or famine in Europe, who came to find work in the textile mills and other burgeoning industries. During the great wave of migration from the 1880s to the 1920s, and I think it's important to note that the largest proportion of foreign-born in the United States, the time when our population was more tipped towards foreign-born as opposed to native-born, was in the period before World War I, not now. There's a larger number, absolutely, because our population has grown to over 300 million, but in the second decade of the 20th century, that was when the highest proportion of our population were people born outside the United States. So this great wave from the 1880s to the 1920s, and that was the wave that all of my grandparents were part of on both sides, we find numerous instances of children traveling alone, sent by a parent to meet an older sibling or a relative in the U.S., or teenagers who were basically considered wage-earning adults by their families. And we know, of course, that the mills here in southeastern Massachusetts were notorious for their use of child labor. This was also true of Chinese immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century, exclusively a male migration because of U.S. restrictive laws that prevented women and families from joining the men who were defined as sojourners. My late father-in-law, who was Chinese, was about 15 years old, a little fuzzy on his exact birth date, when he left China for the United States around 1915, using forged papers, claiming he was the son of a Chinese man who was already here. And this is really characteristic of Chinese migration prior to the post-World War II period. And I obviously don't know what Professor Ida would have talked about, but as Chancellor Grossman mentioned, being part of this airlift, which was condoned and promoted by the United States. So during a Cold War moment, when we were opposed to what we were defining as a communist dictatorship in Cuba, we not only said this was okay, we said this was a good thing, and we sent planes, and the Catholic Church and other governmental agencies were involved in this movement of unaccompanied children to the United States. And it was seen as a heroic effort, and the children were welcomed. And in some cases, it was decades before some of them saw their families again. So I want to look at the roots of the recent wave of migration from Central America. And I think we also need to look at the history of U.S. involvement in the region. As one writer put it, this was a crisis that was actually manufactured in the United States. We could go back historically and look at the role played by United Fruit Company, which is today Chiquita, which established large-scale fruit plantations throughout Central America. It was one of the major investors in Guatemala, leading to the term Banana Republic long before it was taken up by the Gap as a label for its upmarket brand. U.S. companies were major investors, and the United States government supported the military regimes that kept wages low and profits high for U.S. companies. And they backed the military regimes during the civil wars from the 1960s in Guatemala through the 80s and 90s in both Guatemala and El Salvador. And these civil wars led to the first large-scale migrations from El Salvador and from Guatemala to the United States. And it was in the Salvadoran migrant community, the Salvadoran and Guatemalan migrant community in Los Angeles, that the street gangs Mara Salvatrucha, known as MS-13, and Barrio 18, Barrio 18, were formed by Central American teenagers. As part of the drug war, the U.S. deported a lot of gang members back to their home countries, which gave rise to, guess what, street gangs plaguing Central America today. I think it's important to note that there were no large-scale gang problem, and certainly not one allied with organized crime and drug trafficking before the 1990s in Central America. So I just want to talk briefly about Guatemala, and I really want to leave space for Adolfo, because it's what I know best. So I think it's important to look at where the migrants come from. We identify them by nationality, but they're really from specific regions within this country. The Guatemalan migrants who come to the United States, and particularly in this most recent wave, are largely indigenous people from rural areas. These are areas that have historically been poor, at least since the Spanish arrival in 1524, and it's gotten worse since the Civil War, which ended in 1996. And if you look at where migration is coming from, these are often areas where there were the large-scale massacres during the Civil War. Quiche, which is where Adolfo is from, was the area that was hardest hit, had the largest amount of massacres during the war. 626 of the 644 recorded massacres took place in that department. And so you have kind of endemic structural poverty, so the violence of poverty and the violence of the war. And this is a situation that has really gotten worse. Since the fighting ended, you still see that there's over 60% of the population is poor. That's largely concentrated in rural areas. And over 30%, and these are UN statistics, is severely poor. There are 1.5 million children in Guatemala who are chronically malnourished. That's in a country with a population of 13 million, so that's a lot. And again, that's concentrated in rural areas. There's a lack of educational resources and opportunities, although public schooling is free and available. Adolfo and his siblings, for example, had to walk 2.5 kilometers each way over a very isolated, rutted dirt road in order to get to the school in town. There really aren't any jobs in rural areas. There's subsistence farming, but a lot of people lost their land during the armed conflict. People fled to the mountains to escape the fighting. They came back and found that somebody had claimed their land, and you just had to kind of live with it. In some cases, people actually paid to rent back the land that was taken from them during the war. So in town, there's some stores, people hire their relatives, hard to get a job. Where else could you go? Farther away. Girls can go work as domestic servants. That's one of the major sources outside of sex work for young girls in Guatemala. Going to the city where there's violence and gangs, going to work in a maquiladora in a garment factory, or going to work on a plantation in the coast where you work for miserable wages, cutting sugar cane. So there are very few job options. So those are some of the factors that I think push people to come to the United States. So in addition, I think that it's important to see that the war also ripped the social fabric apart. It created distrust among neighbors because people informed on each other or were forced to patrol or were forced in some cases to participate in massacres. Local institutions were destroyed. And it normalized violence. And also because until recently nobody paid for any of the crimes during the war, it meant that people didn't trust the institutions, the judiciary, the police. So people don't report crimes, and that creates this kind of cycle of impunity. There's a very high murder rate, not as high as Honduras. There's an extremely low rate of conviction. It's like less than 2%. No, it's actually 0.32% conviction rate for extrajudicial killings, which means nobody reports it because why bother? And so people resort to violence knowing that there's not very much chance that they'll be caught and less likelihood that they're going to be prosecuted. The military and ex-military are heavily involved in drug trafficking and allied with organized crime. The prison system, and this is an excellent book by a colleague of mine, Deborah Levinson Estrada, called Adios Niño, about the Maras, says that the prison system is basically controlled by criminals and ex-military officers who are in prison, and they basically run their criminal operations and drug trafficking out of the prisons. So the prisons are also this kind of, the judicial system isn't something people have any confidence in. And so this is kind of the culture of impunity. And why children? And in a lot of rural families, children work from an early age to help support the family. Families are large, and while parents, I think, value education very much, it's expensive to buy books and clothing. Schools are often far away, as I've noted. And it's not uncommon for older children to stop their education to work to help support the younger children. In many families, because of the war, fathers were killed. Families were kind of torn, broken up. I'm going to let Adolfo tell his own story, but I think we can see this combination of historical and conjunctural factors. And then lastly, I think in the last couple of years, what's exacerbated this have been neoliberal policies on the part of the government that have favored development projects like mining, cement factories, hydroelectric dams, and that these also encroach on lands and encroach on subsistence. So I think that all of these factors help us understand a little bit of the very gripping stories that we're going to hear. So I'm going to ask Carlos Benavides to come and speak about the situation in Honduras, so we can get sort of at least two of the countries talked about, and then we'll go on to the other panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. I'm going to be talking to you about the situation right now in Honduras with regards to this humanitarian crisis. And also I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the CEDC and the work we do in general, and also with respect to these children and teenagers crossing the border. Before that though, and at the outset, I would like to say that if you are asking yourself, you're going to get more information about all this here, but if you're asking yourself, what can I do about this situation? What effect can I have with respect to this situation? It's so far away in the Texas border, Mexico border. Well, join a community organization such as the CDC or the Immigrants Assistance Center. You know, you can either become a member of the board, or if you don't wish to become a member right now and get involved to that level, then try to collaborate in different ways. There are many ways that you can collaborate with community organizations, either with your time and your effort. Okay, so that is something you can do right away, today or tomorrow. Contact a community organization if you haven't done so already, and see how you can help these children and minors at the border. You can do it even from here. Your efforts will be channeled in a more effective way through a community organization. And if you are a faculty member, like some of us here are, you can implement service learning projects. I have done it in my business Spanish classes, medical Spanish classes. And for the Spanish, it's easier because there's a Hispanic community here, and we can have a more direct effect. But in whatever other area you teach, you can also implement service learning projects and maybe adapt them, then try to find a way to bring benefits to either immigrants, Hispanic immigrants, or even maybe do a project where you can affect somebody positively, somebody at the border. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the situation in Honduras, but first I would like to give you some background of myself, my background in Honduras, because that will give you some insight as to what the situation is and why so many people want to leave that country. But not only that country, I read recently that there was a poll that 2/3 of Mexicans want to leave Mexico. So 2/3. Mexico has about 130 million population. Imagine that. So imagine, and there are already millions of Mexicans here in the United States. Imagine that, and it cuts across all social classes. Not only the poor want to come to the United States, the closest place, but all social classes. Okay, so I was born and raised in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. I went to a bilingual school from kindergarten through 12th grade. And my classmates were the elite of the country. They were the sons and daughters of the top politicians, the former presidents, the leaders of Congress, the top bankers and owners of the biggest companies in the country. I did not belong to that class. There were spaces in that school for middle or lower income people, families, and luckily I got a space there. My parents pushed for that, and also we received scholarships, and we had to have a good academic standing, and I was able to go through, and my sisters, from kindergarten up to 12th grade. So this is the elite, right? The top people in the country. And what was their philosophy? Their philosophy every day, I lived it, I saw it every day, was take everything you can, no matter what, okay? Take everything, win always, no matter what. Do whatever you can to win, to gain everything. Money, whatever, power, anything, okay? And I didn't like that philosophy. It jarred me, even since when I was a little kid and all the way through high school. And that applied also to sports, for example. That's where it applied the most, because we played a lot of sports. We played all sports, almost literally. And they wanted to win, I wanted to win too. Everybody wanted to win at sports. But they wanted to win in whatever way possible, and I didn't like that either. I didn't like that philosophy. I did want to win at all sports all the time, but playing fair, okay? Always playing fair. So that's why I love this metaphor of the level playing field, you know? Because when you play in a level playing field, you really know who's the winner, who's the true winner, and also you really know what your skills are, what your true skills are, who really you are when you play fair on a level playing field. So, and this applies not only to sports, it applies to every aspect of life, back in Honduras and everywhere. But in economics, politics, education, any area, in Honduras still, I left in 1991, there is no level playing field. The field is tilted toward the richest and the most powerful, okay? So I was smack in the middle class, and still I wasn't playing on a level playing field, let alone people in the lower income levels. So even it was tilted even worse like that. So then that was in high school. Then I left high school, went to college at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Honduras and got a degree on business management. And then after that, and during, when I was going to school trying to get jobs, but it was hard to get jobs. And the way to get jobs was through connections, contacts. It happens here, right? It happens everywhere too. But the degree over there is huge. So I couldn't really get a good job. I had to go to them, to my ex-classmates, and try to see if I could get a really good job. Otherwise, I would get jobs that were not really that good. But what happened? To get jobs at their banks or their companies or whatever, I had to do what they did. I had to be what they were. I had to be like them. And then the world is yours, huh? Like the sign in Scarface, the movie. So I didn't like that either. I didn't want that. Didn't want that world. I wanted a world where people played in a level playing field, where really you worked hard, worked smart, were honest, and you really got ahead. So what was the place? I know you've heard it's a platitude, but it's the United States. It's the place where you can do that. It's not perfect. There's corruption here as in Honduras. There is impunity also. There is contacts and connections that are important here too, but not to the degree that it is in Honduras and other Latin American countries. Imagine if I, who was so relatively privileged, wanted to leave Honduras so badly. Imagine so many other people who didn't have the privileges I had. And on top of that, when I was there, on top of not getting a good job, other conditions that still occur right now. It seems as if time had stopped. Power outages, constant. Here we complain about a power outage because there's a storm. Oh, but it happens every now and then. There is 3 power outages a month, you know. Frequent water shortages, water rationing is going on. So I was working, studying or something, and then a power outage. And it was not like 15 minutes. It was days or hours. And that is, as I said, that is still happening. Why? Because of the inefficiency and the corruption in the government offices and the government organizations, for example. So that, and also lack of opportunities, and then increasingly, when I left in '91, it was the gang problem was starting, but there was already violence, and yes, a lot of policemen and ex-military involved, and they're trained, so they're very good at thievery and at stealing, at going to a store and a bank and stealing everything with these AK-47s and these heavy weapons that they really know how to use. And these were some of the ex-military that were part of in the 80s of those death squads. Also, they were trained, they were cold in killing people, in killing anybody. And they are still part of those groups that are part of the criminal element. So, okay, that gives you then some background as to why so many people want to leave our countries. And that happens in Mexico too. You just heard in Mexico, 43-something students are lost. They were going to protest, and some military, they got into a fight with police and military, and now they don't know where they are, and they have opened several fosas, holes, I forget the word in English, and they haven't found others, and they haven't found them. And so that is still going on right now in Mexico. Tremendous injustice. Now they're comparing it to the 1968 massacre in Tlatelolco, which was a tremendous injustice as well. So the roots of the problem. So I can understand why all these people, minors and adults, want to come to the United States, right? If I wanted to, I put myself in their shoes, and I understand it. And I understand why they want to risk crossing all those deserts and all those countries to come here, because for them it's basically they don't have nothing to lose. Okay, and so. For example, they were saying that they are trying to, what's going on, one of the things that's going on in Honduras right now is a publicity and government announcements, public announcements saying, don't go, don't leave because it is too dangerous, and the smugglers are lying to you that the government is going to take you in. That's why they say that so many children are arriving, because supposedly because of a new law, then now they can easily come into the United States. But that's not why they're coming. They're coming by everything I described to you right now. So the roots of the problem are an unfair economic system, not a level playing field, where the workers in the middle class do not enjoy a level playing field, corruption and impunity, and they need to be attacked. But I want to stress that this all comes. The elites, the upper classes can change these things. They can change. Of course, the United States also has an influence. You know, the United States supports these elites, unfortunately. And in the past, they have supported dictators that belong to these elites. But these elites can change things. In 2009, there was a coup d'etat in Honduras, and it was the elites that did everything, and they controlled everything. So they can, if they were to give a little more equality to people, to make the field a little more level, things could change for everybody. But they're not doing it. They keep that philosophy of everything for me, no matter what. Okay, so now I am going to tell you about the current situation and what the government has done. I think this current government, which is from a right-wing party, is doing a few things that are, I think are positive and more center-left. I don't know if it's because they want to appease those who are not right-wingers, or if it's something that's going to be permanent. Let's hope it is, and that this right-wing party is doing things that are more sensible. So the First Lady, Ana Garcia de Hernandez, visited the border, and I'm going to read a little bit here, in Texas in June, shortly after the first wave of children immigrants, to take a look at the situation firsthand and bring helpful information back to Honduras. This was in June. Then a little later on, you might have read in the news, the President, Juan Orlando Hernandez, met with President Obama and other Central American presidents to discuss ways to stem the massive immigration and improve economic and safety conditions for these minors. So these are things that happen almost at the moment of these surges of immigrants. And then what has been happening there is that the United States has been providing funds, millions of dollars, to build shelters in Honduras to assist unaccompanied minors that are being returned and who have been deported after a process that I'll describe in a second. In these shelters, they are provided with food, they can stay for a few days, and some money for transportation to go back to their places. Also, funds have been allocated for centers for at-risk youth. They provide support for youth. There already existed centers, but now the United States is giving more money for those to educate teenagers not to go into the gangs and all the horrible things they do to other people and to themselves, making them aware of that. And also funds from the states for general safety, and as I said before, the public announcements saying that the smugglers are coming up with these lies about the new laws. And those are some of the things that are going on right now. And now, let me tell you a little bit about the CDC then. The CDC, which is the organization I'm a member of the board of. The CDC provides information to immigrants to help them navigate the system and connects immigrants with resources that will help them stabilize their situation. You can visit CDC website at cdcnewbedford.org, and also there's a page on Facebook. And let me tell you about the CDC focus areas. Economic development, community building, improving the neighborhood, and organizing and public policy. And then some of the programs match or are within some of those focus areas. Some of the major programs I'm going to read to you are the Immigrant Support Network, Bus Riders United, Volunteers and Tax Assistance or VITA, Small Business Technical Assistance, Great Neighborhoods Program, and Working Waterfront Festival. The CDC helps to organize that. The CDC sees about 70 to 100 different families every month, some families several times a month depending on the issue. In addition, CDC receives dozens of phone calls weekly from families. Outside of tax season, our office walk-ins are 85% immigrants. We help with many different services, including translation assistant, and I got the percentages, 21%, immigration issues, 16%, education, 14%, tax prep and resolution, 10%, transportation, 8%, work-related problems, 5%, and numerous other categories that make up the remaining percentage. We are working with approximately 160 families who have immigration issues throughout the year. This is our staff, CEDC staff. These can be unaccompanied minors at the border trying to fill out 30-page packets so they can be released. Imagine, they need help. These little kids who sometimes unaccompanied, who need to fill out these papers, 30-page packets. Okay, and just to close, I would like to say that one of our board members, Jennifer Velarde, who is here, where are you, Jennifer? Yes, she is a lawyer as well, and she has been to the border to actually help some of the unaccompanied children and connect their family to the child. So I need to wrap up, so I would just like to ask Jennifer to briefly describe your experience, and then we close.
Besides being a lawyer, I feel a connection with the families, a connection with the children, and I want to help. And that's the best way I can do to help.
And you help the unaccompanied minors connect to their families and be reunited, right?
Yes, I actually, as a lawyer right now, I do a lot of immigration cases. That's what I do as a living. But I've been able to connect a lot of families right now with their children, and in some cases I had to go to another state to kind of see the child and being able to get the child together with a parent or whoever is in the state to be reunited with.
And she has been able to do this through the CDC. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Well, this was really an unexpected pleasure to have Jennifer, with whom I have worked on cases as well, because it allows me to make a very good segue to the next speaker, because Jennifer is a graduate of the UMass Law School, and Jennifer was a student of Irene, who is going to be the next person who speaks, is an attorney who has been working really since the 1980s on immigration cases and directs the immigration clinic at the University of Massachusetts Law School.
I'm not going to talk much about the clinic, but I'd be happy afterwards to chat with you, because I was asked to talk more broadly about the legal issues involved in what we've been seeing here. So as Professor Meyer has said, children have been coming across the U.S. border for decades, more than decades, and in many cases unaccompanied by any parent. In fact, more recently, through the 1980s to early 90s, when they arrived on foot, I mean, the arrivals over the Mexican border are more recent than those who came in the early parts of the 20th century by boats and whatever. But more recently, in the 1980s, when children arrived here on their own by foot and were apprehended by the Border Patrol agents, they'd often be encouraged to sign papers saying that they wanted to go back home. However, if they spoke Spanish, they were young, they virtually never spoke English, there were no translators provided with all of these legal papers they were asked to sign, so they were signing their name to a paper that they largely did not understand. Nor, even if they did understand what was said on the papers, they didn't understand the ramifications of what they were signing. And as a result of that, I got interested in the issue of what was happening to the unaccompanied minors, and I and others started to investigate and write about the psychological difficulties that children have in general understanding the concept of a legal right, and particularly children who are in a foreign country and with a language they can't speak, completely alone without their parents, really didn't understand what was going on and what they were being asked to do. They were being asked to knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily relinquish their legal rights to stay here and agree to go back across the border. So we started writing about that, and something worked. A lot of things worked, actually, have worked in immigration over the last 40 or so years that I've been watching. And regulations were instituted in the early 90s to help protect the children coming across, make sure there were translators and other avenues for them to actually be informed to some extent of their legal rights. They were entitled to lawyers, but not lawyers paid by the government. And so that was actually a good thing that happened. So we've been seeing these children coming across the border, and this, quote, crisis is really not It is a crisis, and as Lisa was talking about, it is a very difficult situation for people, for children to be in, largely with their mothers, if they're here with any parent. But it's not new at all, and it shouldn't and probably wasn't a surprise to our government that they were coming. So I'm going to kind of take off from what Lisa was saying. There really is no surge. Children represent a small share of all apprehensions by the Border Patrol, the same small share that they have represented over the better part of the last decade. And the surge in those who are being classified as unaccompanied alien children, I hate that word, I only use it when I'm reading from the law, is an artifact of a new law that went into effect in 2008. We call the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008. And that requires classification of people who are arrested, detained at the border in a much more careful manner than was required before that. And so, whereas in 2008, the numbers of unaccompanied children were supposedly 7,500, in 2009, the first year after this law went into effect, there were 20,000. So that really explains that it's not a surge in numbers, it's just a change in the categories in which the numbers were being placed. Further, there were legitimate accusations that Border Patrol agents were actually intentionally miscalculating or misclassifying some of the people who were coming in as not being children, not being minors, not being unaccompanied. There was a 2007 congressional report from the Congressional Research Service that highlighted claims that Border Patrol agents were intentionally misclassifying children. So in any event, the U.S. government should have been expecting people to come across the border, for them to be children, for them to be mothers, for them to be alone, for them to not have anywhere to go. Especially with the, as you've heard, increasing dangers in Central America. Some of the increased danger, has to do with the fact that the U.S. has been, what they say, successful in thwarting the drug trafficking coming here from Colombia. Instead, what's happened is we have these airfields that were built in Honduras and in the flatlands of Guatemala, actually kind of, I think they call it offloading drugs, now not from Colombia, but from the countries in Central America. So I have to say I wholeheartedly agree with what's been said prior. So these children were coming, they were expected, and it's really a terrible shame that the government was not prepared for this kind of an influx. Once here, the children and their mothers have been treated horribly. You know about these family detention centers. The one that's most notorious, about which there was a lawsuit filed by the ACLU and many, many other organizations in July, is in a remote area called Artesia in New Mexico, many hours from any decent-sized city, where they house more than 500 women and children. And the lawsuit charges, and this is a lawsuit that is on the basis of this particular place, Artesia, New Mexico, but represents what's happening at the family detention centers that the Obama administration has set up over the last several months. The accusations in the lawsuit involve violating the Immigration and Nationality Act, that is the Immigration Act that's been governing our country for many, many decades. The Convention Against Torture, we are not allowed to send people back to countries where it's likely that they're going to be tortured. Against the regulations that we have that are supposed to protect these people, such as the ones I explained that took place in the early 90s. Even violations of the Administrative Procedure Act, which is just a law, not just, but it's a law, many parts, very complicated, but it assures that people having hearings have fair notice of what the hearing is about, understand what the hearing is about, get time to prepare for the hearing, get time to hire lawyers, are allowed to contact lawyers. But when you're in the middle of nowhere, hours, and the Immigration Service has been doing this for decades, sending people all around the country to places where their family can't get, and they can't get lawyers. But when you're in this situation where you have what are called expedited removal, quick deportation hearings because you came across the border and the patrol agents don't believe that you have any reason to stay, all of this is accelerated. And when it's accelerated in a place where it's very difficult for people to get there, your ability to exercise any of your rights is highly constrained. So all of these laws were alleged to have been violated. In addition, as I hinted, the procedural breaches, procedural rights. I mean, if you can't assert your right, then what's the purpose of having any right? So, for example, if you're detained at the border and you say you're afraid to go back, you're supposed to have an interview. It's called a credible fear interview. It's not the essence of proving that you have a political asylum case. It's much lower standard. Should the government put you in a situation whereby you can actually try to prove to the immigration authorities or a judge that it's dangerous for you to go back home. And so there were prejudgments against essentially all of these people that they had no rights to apply. And it turns out close to 40% of them have what they call colorable or legitimate claims to apply for asylum. That they were applying more burdensome, harsher standards for the people so that they were not able to assert their claims than was usual. They were intimidating. They were coercing people, trying to dissuade them from exercising their rights. They were restricting, as I hinted, access to the phones for contact with attorneys, with family members, and other people who could help them build their cases. And they were not giving them adequate notice or information that they were having these credible fear hearings, or that these credible fear hearings or kind of conversations were important. So none of their rights were being protected, their actual rights or their ability to even exercise their rights and know what their rights were. And also the lawsuit says that as a result of this, the Constitution is being violated because all of these procedural violations constitute a violation of the Fifth Amendment, which allows people to have the due process to go through a system and get notice of hearing and have the ability to present the argument that they want to present. How close am I to time? 2 minutes. Okay, so if you want to look at the lawsuit, I can give you the information about it later. The lawsuit is raised on behalf of 3 mothers and their children, 1 from Honduras and 2 from El Salvador, and it explains what these plaintiffs say occurred in their countries and why they can't go back and why they were afraid. And they're asking, obviously, for this expedited or really detain and deport policy be stayed, that the court says that they can't do it anymore, that the ongoing deportations should not go on, that corrective action should be ordered by the court, that these people should have a meaningful opportunity to prove whether or not they have the right to asylum, that any person who has been deported as a result of this be brought back to have an adequate hearing, and also they're asking for attorney's fees under the Equal Access to Justice Act, which is very helpful. Because they're doing this all voluntarily, of course. And so in the midst of all of this, President Obama announces in September to build another 2,400-bed place in Dilley, Texas. Anyone ever been to Dilley, Texas? It must exist somewhere. Don't know. So I have, wrapping up, okay. Just want you to know a couple of good things, because I don't like to end on a negative note. Lawyers have actually been authorized for the first time. The federal government is not just saying you have the right to bring a lawyer, they're actually funded $4.2 million. And a bunch of people, including in Boston, are being hired around the country to help give legal advice to these unaccompanied minors, and supposedly $4.8 million will come out next year. However, there are 260 immigration judges in the country. They each can do about 1,500 cases a year. So with the lawyers, that's fantastic, but we need more judges. And final note, in spite of the billions and billions of dollars, I don't know the number there, of Border Patrol money that's been paid, of fence money building a border for over the last 14 years or so, it was good enough to build all these fences and to apprehend all these people, but the government hasn't even been able to supply the lawyers and even the courts to allow these people to present their claims. Happy to take questions afterwards, and thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Father Mark Fallon, whose ministry to the community in New Bedford includes everything from baptizing babies to calling up the school to help people get admission to the high school, to accompanying people to the police if they get assaulted on the streets of New Bedford. So it's a very multifaceted ministry. He has really helped me understand the concept of accompaniment, which is kind of from the radical Catholic worker tradition of, this is how we can best work with communities and underprivileged communities, is accompanying people in their struggles. Mark Fallon.
Thank you, Dr. Nauer. My privilege to be here. In the introduction, I mentioned I've been with Catholic Social Services on behalf of the immigrant community of Central Americans in New Bedford for the past decade. As a priest in the Congregation of Holy Cross, we conduct Stonehill College adjacent to Brockton and located in Easton. So we, along with Bristol community and this campus, are the people who do higher education in Bristol County. So thanks so very much to Chancellor Grossman, Dr. Nauer, and all involved with the proceedings this afternoon. And when our colleagues, Querida Abogada Jennifer, when Jennifer arrived, my brother Jose, and our dear colleague Corinne arrived, I knew we had plenty of source of information for our discussion. So just want to share a number of perspectives from how it is that the faith communities are involved with the issue of migration. The question was actually raised to us, sadly, a number of years ago when the Bianca federal intervention came up. And I think either we were so busy or we were so stunned that anyone could raise the question that I didn't have a polite response at the time. Certainly, we as churches are transnational organizations. I've been to many meetings in favor of immigration reform on behalf of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. It's a basic unit of organizing for Catholic organizations in any particular country. For example, the regional body for Latin America is known as CELAM, the Episcopal Conference for Latin America. And we believe that with the structures that we have available to us, whether it is Catholic Relief Services dealing with assistance overseas, with development issues, sadly issues of drought or ongoing or chronic poverty, or migrant and refugee services, assisting those who are being resettled in conjunction with the federal government, in conjunction with those contracts. We would hope that the Catholic Church represents the faith communities who are advocating. To be sure, there is a chorus of harmony, of echoing. There is strong support from the faith communities, and the examples I have today will simply be from the Catholic perspective. Early on, I had the privilege of visiting Brown University just over in Providence, and I learned a concept that was presented to us by a sitting government official from Central America. And he wanted us as North Americans to understand some of the conceptual framework issues that many in the United States have in relating to Central America. So the man's name is Eduardo Steen, and in the middle of the first decade of this century, he was the sitting vice president of Guatemala. His daughter had attended Brown, a student organization had invited him on campus. And I was struck, and I still remember to this point, that his message was really to help us understand what exactly a weak democracy in Latin America is, particularly in Central America. We've heard mention the United Fruit Company, some of the strength of these transnational corporations, who in many cases are stronger than the elected governments in these particular nations. And Vice President Steen was very clear in his remarks that there was a basic frustration in any conversation with Latin America and Washington, particularly with the concepts that were held over from a time when, during the Cold War, you were either in the Soviet sphere or in the sphere of democracy. Very little consideration, very little understanding of the gray areas, the levels of the way that that any particular government entity could be described in one way or another. And as a result, with the lack of understanding, it is so very hard for those in the United States, certainly ourselves, to understand suddenly, as Memorial Day came upon us this summer, how could such a number of young children, unaccompanied minors, or however we wish to describe them, how could so many of them feel compelled to leave home? How could parents allow them to make such a dangerous journey over such a harsh landscape toward an uncertain future? And so as we recall Vice President Steen's remarks, this has stayed with me in concepts of, or different discussions. Unfortunately, as a Catholic Church, as a transnational organization, we are very fortunate for the way in which we have had conversations with the Diocese of Quiché. Fortunately, before the draconian intervention of the Bianca raid, and there was no hesitation from anyone in the bishop's office there to let us know, and to let anyone who would listen, that the economic hardships were ongoing in rural Central America, in the indigenous region, in the Quiché diocese, in the Quiché department. And Bishop Molina, I believe, is now in Shela or Quetzaltenango, but he clearly said, please let anyone know who will listen that the young people are still coming. This was long before the drug trade advanced to the stage of such power and such deleterious influence and such a negative impact for rural Central America. And for a simple overview on the considerations of the faith communities, certainly there's a common lectionary for many of the Christian communities over the last 40 years. The first reading at worship yesterday had to do with Exodus, when the people were enjoined to remember that when they began their relationship with God, they were homeless. They were living under a harsh dictator, and they entered a journey of uncertainty, of fear, in which they placed their confidence in their God on heaven. Chapter 2 in the Christian scriptures, the Gospel of Matthew, suggests that the Son of God was homeless. We owe the creche scenes that come around in December to Francis of Assisi. And what those are actually saying was that for the Christian narrative of salvation, the Son of God was born homeless, impoverished, and to parents who were on a journey which eventually led them to Egypt. In general terms, the U.S. Bishop's intervention on behalf of immigration reform for the last several years has had to do that persons have the right to find work where they are. When there are no realistic opportunities for work, it is inherent upon the human person the right to seek work elsewhere, to migrate. And this is balanced upon the right of the sovereign. Now again, with the evidence we have presented to us, the overwhelming and the increasing, sadly, strength of the drug cartels in Latin America give very question, as we build upon Mr. Steen's remarks about the legitimacy of the elected governments in Latin America, particularly in Central America, from which the young people came. Recent remarks by the bishops over the summer had to do with the importance of the reality of the gangs and how it's so very difficult for not only for families to raise their children, but for governments to protect their residents. Again, thank you so very much for the opportunity to be here this afternoon, and I'm confident they will have a lively discussion following. Thank you.
This is really a tremendous honor to be able to present Adolfo de la Cruz. Es un gran honor presentar a Adolfo de la Cruz. When I first met him, he was on the road, that 2.5 kilometer road that I talked to you about, walking to school with his brother. La primera vez que le conocí, que fue en este camino de 2 kilómetros, caminando de la escuela para la casa. So he's going to tell us about his journey, and I will do my best to translate.
Mi nombre es Adolfo de la Cruz García, soy de Guatemala, tengo 16 años.
I'm Adolfo de la Cruz Garcia from Guatemala. I'm 16 years old.
Quiero hablarles sobre mi historia, todo lo que yo he pasado.
I want to tell you about my story, everything that I've gone through.
Okay. Nosotros venimos acá, no es que porque queramos, nosotros venimos acá por un motivo, a través de problemas, a través de amenazas.
So we didn't come here because we just wanted to. We came because of a problem, because of threats.
Por ejemplo, yo me vine acá porque yo estaba perseguido por 3 hombres.
I came here because I was being persecuted and followed by 3 men.
Todo empezó cuando ellos mataron a mi padre, lo envenenaron.
It all started when they killed my father. They poisoned him.
Lo llevaron en una cantina, en un bar, ahí lo envenenaron y nosotros nos enteramos en la mañana.
So they took him to a bar and they poisoned him, and we didn't find out until the next morning.
Esto fue duro para nosotros y para toda mi familia cuando escuchamos que mi padre ya lo habían matado.
So this was very hard for my entire family when we heard that they'd killed my father.
Esos 3 hombres lo hicieron a través de nuestra cultura, porque nosotros somos indígenas y también a través de políticas.
So they did it because of our culture, because we're indigenous, and was also for political motives.
Y después de 2 semanas, ellos violaron a mi hermana.
And 2 weeks later, they raped my sister.
Lo amenazaron, le dijeron que si ella lo va a decir a mi mamá, lo van a matar.
And they threatened her. They said if she told my mother, they'd kill her.
Y mi hermana tuvo miedo de decirle a mi mamá, entonces no la dijo a mi mamá, sino que ella aguantó todo lo que le hicieron.
So she was afraid of saying anything to my mother, so she didn't say anything, and she just held in everything that had happened to her.
Después esos mismos tipos querían abusarse de mi mamá.
They also wanted to abuse my mother, these same guys.
Pero mi mamá no se dejó, pudo escapar de esos tipos. Y esos tipos en ese mismo instante, cuando yo recuerdo que estábamos jugando con mi hermano, llegaron junto a nosotros y a mí me puso la pistola en la cabeza y me dice que con eso va a matar a toda mi familia y a mí.
So my mother was able to escape, but I remember at that time that I was playing with my brother, and these guys came up, and one of them held a pistol to my head and said that that was what they were going to use to kill all of us.
Y yo tuve mucho miedo, y yo con mi hermano fuimos a decirle a mi mamá todo lo que está pasando.
So I had a lot of fear, and my brother and I went to tell my mother everything that was happening.
Entonces mi mamá fue a buscar ayuda y no la ayudaron. Lo que hizo fue al Ministerio Público a denunciarlos.
So my mother went to get help, but she really wasn't able to get help. She went to the public ministry to write out a complaint against these guys.
Pero la policía no hizo nada.
But the police didn't do anything.
Solo fue lo que hizo, fue a quitar el arma y no llevó preso a esos hombres.
So all they did was that they took the gun away, but they didn't take those guys prisoner.
Y nosotros tuvimos miedo, tuvimos que mudarnos.
So we were very afraid, and so we had to move.
Y esos tipos, nosotros fuimos al otro país y esos tipos aún nos siguen molestando. Entonces, mi mamá decidió que la mejor manera de que ellos ya no nos molesten es salirnos de ahí.
So we went to another municipality, but the abuses continue, and so my mother said that the best way to get out of this was to leave.
y nosotros tuvimos que venir para acá. Mi mamá nos dio todo, nos dijo que ella se va a quedar ahí, entonces nos dio todo el dinero para que nosotros nos venimos para acá.
And so my mother stayed and she gave us all the money that she could for us to make the journey here.
Entonces crucé a México, vine con un guía y ese guía me maltrata muy mal, nos maltratan a todos muy mal.
So I went through Mexico and we were with a guide, and the guide treated us really badly. He treated all of us really badly.
No nos daban de comer, solo una vez al día.
They didn't give us anything to eat, just one time a day.
Y nos trata muy mal, nos trata como un animal, no nos respetan.
They treated us really badly. They treated us like animals. They didn't respect us.
Y cuando yo crucé la frontera, ahí me agarraron, me mandaron en una hielera.
So when I crossed the border, they got me and they threw me into, he's used the term hielera, which is like an ice pan, a place that's very cold.
Eso fue más duro para mí, porque ahí no nos daban de comer y no nos daban de cómo cubrirnos, de cobijas. Solo nos daba un sándwich cada día.
So they didn't give us anything to eat, they didn't give us blankets to cover ourselves, they just gave us one sandwich a day. This was U.S. government INS detention.
Y cuando no nos dejan dormir, ellos nos levantan a patadas.
So they didn't let us sleep, they would kick us until we were awake.
Esto fue más duro para mí, pero cuando salí ahí, fui a un casa hogar, ahí se me tratan bien.
So that was very hard, but then I was able to go to a home for children. There's special facilities that are for minors who immigrants who are underage, and he said that they treated him there very well.
Y después estoy acá, entonces yo tengo miedo. O sea, tengo miedo que a mi familia le pasa algo.
So I'm still very afraid. I'm afraid that something might happen to my family.
Porque yo sé si esos hombres llegan a encontrar a mi mamá, de seguro que lo matan.
So I'm sure that if these men find my mother, that they're going to kill her. That's all I want to say. So I want to thank Adolfo so much for, I know this is not a pleasant story to share. I will say he is a student at New Bedford High School, and he told us that he's getting all A's in his classes, so I think we really want to applaud him for his hard work. Tú recibes buenas notas A y A plus en tus clases y esperamos que te puedo ver aquí como estudiante. So I'm hoping we might see him here as a student at UMass one day, I hope. I want to open this up for comments, for questions, for any of the panelists, just responses to this. I realize that you've heard a lot, both information as well as personal story and narrative.
I saw a film which was so graphic, which was called Which Way North, and it was screened by the Spanish Cine Club. I recommend it to anyone. My question is, because it's so graphic and so visual, and in that film, I think all of them returned and were unsuccessful in their lives. My question is, we heard a lot about the surge and how there was history. We should not have been surprised about the surge. And there was a history, there has been a history of immigration. We should have been prepared. My question is really, why were we not more prepared? And from Carlos, we heard about what we can do. I'd like to hear more about what we can do specifically. Yours was very, very specific in the action that we can take. So those are two questions, more about what can be done, and also why were we not prepared?
I also want to just say something. I know Irene didn't get to talk completely about the work that the Immigration Clinic is doing, so clearly students in the law school, anybody with Spanish language skills, there are clearly concrete things that one can do. And student attorneys, even those who don't speak Spanish, are doing a lot of work to support cases for people who do, when they arrive here, who do have legitimate claims to make, as well as CEDC. There's also the Centro Comunitario de Trabajadores, which works mostly with, not so much with undocumented youth, but with immigrants, fighting injustice and conditions here. I think that the reasons, for why we weren't prepared, we've been in a national quandary about immigration for a very long time, right? It's not that this problem sort of began yesterday. It's been, since 1986, there hasn't really been a substantial immigration reform. That was the so-called amnesty of, the 1980s, but there hasn't been a major overhaul. And, clearly, politically, we're very divided, right? There are manufacturers and farmers and people who are saying, to our elected officials, change the system, this isn't working, we don't want to be there are some business people who say we would rather not be hiring people off the books, we'd rather be hiring them, legally, and there are occasionally business people or, farmers in upstate New York or Massachusetts who will legally, contract workers, but in terms of addressing it on a global issue, I think that's a political issue. I don't know if Carlos or anyone else really wants to speak to why we were not prepared, because clearly they've been building detention facilities, and that's where we're putting a lot of money into that. Irene, do you want to speak to this?
A couple of things. It actually is really profit-making to have a detention facility. It's, when I started doing this work around here in 2002, I think the going rate per day to keep someone in detention, here we have the Bristol House of Corrections, is our local detention center, was about $90 a day. It's now well over $100 a day per person. So there's lots. I'm not a political scientist, so I can hypothesize about some of the possible causes. There's a lot of for-profit private prisons now, so that's a big business. Secondly, the people coming from Central America these days are expressing much more detail, like Adolfo has expressed. So they're expressing legitimate fear of going back, not just there was no hope for a job in my town, so my mom said go. They're expressing specific grounds on which should enable them to have a hearing and prove whether or not they're entitled to asylum. So those people don't leave the system quickly enough. What happens to someone like Adolfo is the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, now takes care of these kids once they've been here for about 3 days, and tries to resettle them with family members in the United States. And as Lisa said, many of these people have many family members around the country, from cousins, if not brothers, sisters, cousins, and they get resettled, and their cases then get transferred to the state where the immigration court where they're sent. So that's just a few of the possible reasons. People not moving in and out quickly enough because they actually have legitimate claims, and there's definitely incentive to keep people in prison. It's very profit-making. Obviously, there's political reasons to build these places and have people in massive, frightening detention. Obviously, if word does get back home that this is what you're going to meet when you get here, maybe you'll take the chance of staying home. Maybe that's what the politicians are thinking. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll try to answer both questions at least briefly. I think one of the reasons they were surprised is that this time that they were immigrating, a lot of the minors and unaccompanied children just were not hiding from the Border Patrol. They were not running away. They just turned themselves in mass, and I think that surprised the Border Patrol. They didn't have to chase them. They just were there, showing up, take me in, and then they would send them to a center. So I think that's a large part why they weren't prepared. And I see the director of the Immigrants Assistance Center here, Elena Da Silva Hughes. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but to answer the second question, do you think you could tell us a little bit about how somebody could do something directly or more specifically in Holloway's question through the Immigrants Assistance Center? Do you think you can enlighten us a little bit about that?
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, well, what's happening is since we started hearing about the kids coming to the border and basically unoccupied minors, and we started getting phone calls, and I work very closely with Corinne at CDC about these children who are at the border, and now the families were calling us trying to see what they needed to do in order to bring the children back. And what we've done is working closely with CDC and saying, you know, what can we do? And there wasn't really much that we could do, and also working with Catholic Social Services to make sure they had legal representation. And once they got here, and a lot of them have been reunited with their families that are here, and it's just you know, it's just a sad situation, because when we talk about what's happening, it doesn't seem like we're taking very small steps, and we all know that what we need is an immigration reform. And unfortunately, immigration reform becomes a political football during elections, and nothing gets done. I've been working with the immigrant population for 30 years. And let me tell you, immigration reform, there were times, especially when President Obama got elected, that hopefully there was going to be an immigration reform. And we were very happy when he did the executive order for DACA, because he gave basically the students an opportunity to stay here legally for 2 years, and then they could apply up to 6 years. And there's basically, it does not lead them to a green card, but it does give them some, at least some kind of protection. So I think that these are like little small things that's been happening that we've been able to really help the immigrant students, and we've been working very closely with students at New Bedford High School to help them apply through DACA. And so I'm not sure, I think that we still have to come along, it's still a long way, but I think DACA has helped them, some students, to apply for, so this way they can temporarily stay in the United States and get a driver's license and go to school. And so that's, you know, maybe think that's positive, but it's just a Band-Aid. So really what we really need is an immigration reform, because we need a path to legalization, which unfortunately seems very hard, especially during politics, and it's just been used as a political football. At the Immigrants Assistance Center, we're always looking for volunteers, especially students that speak other languages, Portuguese, Cape Verdean, Creole, and Spanish, because I think that is really where the students can really make an impact, is working through the center and organizations like the CDC to become basically their voice and mentors to these students.
So I have a question, but this might be best placed to our UMass Law alum in the front seat. Or anyone else. And the last speaker just mentioned one opportunity, but the question is basically, are there opportunities for UMass Dartmouth students to serve either in Texas or Miami or Florida or locally? Like, I'm thinking maybe in terms of like an alternative spring break experience, something like that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I graduated from the law school, I volunteered in a lot of places, and I use my language skills. I speak Spanish, I speak some Portuguese, but I'm very fluent in Spanish, and I speak English. And initially I worked for South Coastal Kansas Legal Services, and then I went to work with the AmeriCorps program at the CDC. And working there, I realized, and I was in shock to see members in the community telling me stories like the gentleman over here that they went through, and nothing was being done. And that's when I realized, probably, although I'm a small person compared to the whole population, I might be able to help them do something, tell the stories in English so people can understand what's going on, translating, trying to get more information for them, trying to get them connected with organizations that can do things for them for free. So that was how I help, and I think that's how others can help too. Even if they don't speak the language, probably volunteering and connecting people with organizations, giving information that they might know that others, that they might know but others might not know. So it's been a pleasure.
What about the student immigrant?
Yes, so I was also part of the student immigrant movement, and they can also participate as and become a member of the student immigrant movement. So the student immigrant movement, for those who do not know, it's a group of students that were raised in the United States, but they grew up here, they speak English, and they are part of our culture and our society. But because of they came very young, and because of their parents' situation, they do not have legal status. And they created the student immigrant movement. Through the student immigrant movement, they have been able to accomplish a lot of things, like DACA. They mobilized to actually go to Congress, go to Washington, D.C., be in protest, and fight for something like DACA, and also to help others who are in detention centers to be released from those detention centers. So you're also welcome to join the student immigrant movement, and if you do not know how to get in touch with the student immigrant movement, I have all the information, so probably after this you can ask me.
Or call CDC too.
Or call the CDC too, yes.
So this is also, I was going to say, not specifically around the crisis of child migrants, but this was something that we had been discussing with the Chancellor when we had a visit from her in New Bedford, when there was some concern about the violent assaults against members of the immigrant community, and talking about setting up perhaps some kind of a cooperative class, or having UMass students and people in the community doing some kind of a class together, kind of based on the sort of the inside-out model, where students do a class in a prison context, and could we do something in a community context. We haven't gotten that far with that. Other things have kind of eclipsed that, but I think that we would want to perhaps explore what are their ideas. Clearly there are internships, there's the experiential learning. There are many, if people want to do things, I think we can help them through the undergraduate school get credit for doing that, either through the LeDuc Center, through internships in your department, or through experiential learning. But developing a more sustained kind of program for the university, I think, is something that we still need to put a little bit of brain power into.